All right, thanks everyone for coming today. We've been looking forward to this conversation for a while, so we're just going to jump right in. I want to start, Bilva, with you. Okay, so as the AI ethics and safety manager at Google DeepMind, you and your team were responsible for providing the developer guardrails for Genie 3, DeepMind's interactive world model that can generate playable environments from text or image prompts in real time, as well as Veo 3, DeepMind's audiovisual diffusion model. So can you describe the kinds of risks and safety considerations that you have to keep in mind as you are for generative media models or multimodal models, both in the immediate and emerging contexts?
Awesome. So glad to be here. Obviously, I wish I had 5 hours to answer this question, but I guess from a very high level, one call out is that I think there's a lot of focus on LLMs, the kinds of harms that they pose, and there's generally a little bit more comfort with understanding text out risks. I think the multimodal space, the generative media space broadly gets ignored. This is not me calling out anyone in particular. It's just very difficult to capture those risks, and we're still really understanding how they scale. With respect to Genie 3, for example, like this is the first interactive usable world model that's state of the art. And there's a reason that when we released it, it was only as an academic preview to a group of like 10 multidisciplinary researchers, and other people don't have access to it yet because there's a lot of safety to do some hill climbing on. The other thing I want to say is that like with generative media in particular, something to keep in mind is the addition of viscerality, emotion, virality as a result of this content proliferating at scale, as Sam Gregory pointed out very well in the previous intro. And this can be really, really difficult to control, which is why we have things like synth ID and attribution, but this is just still covering a very small piece of the problem. And it's an important thing to highlight that this is not a silver bullet for some of the problems that we're facing. So yeah, that's what I would broadly say. I don't want to take up too much time talking about it, but multimodal models are super challenging and we need more red teaming, research, evaluations, and we need to understand where the addition of a different modality adds a safety harm or a safety consideration, like how audio or speech or dialogue increases emotion, increases viscerality, and that may be worse for human AI companionship related concerns. So thank you.
Thanks, Bilva. Thanks for getting us started with that. John, I'm going to turn to you for this one. MasterCard is both a developer of AI systems in-house as well as a deployer. So I'm very curious, as you're in a highly regulated industry, how do you make the decision of which systems and tools to build versus which to buy? And does the governance process change between those two?
Yeah, okay. So first off, I will say that I'm not personally making those choices. Just want to be very clear. We are responsible for managing the risks associated with the AI systems MasterCard builds and buys. People don't often ask me which ones they to buy. So in terms of how that distributes, I say MasterCard operates a payments network, and to keep this very brief, we build AI systems that secure that payments network, that add personalization, that help resolve disputes, sort of between merchants and issuers and so on. And a lot of that stuff we build in-house because it's intellectual property, it is a competitive advantage, and because it's necessary for it to work extremely well in order to run the network. Meanwhile, the enterprise tends to be buying the stuff that either it can't easily build itself or that it can't build fast enough itself. So with generative foundation models and the rise of foundation models, a lot of the productivity stuff, a lot of like specific marketing campaigns that people wanted to move fast, they're being bought. And when it comes to the risk profile between those two sort of internally built and externally built systems and those groups, I wouldn't say that there's higher risk necessarily in the external space. I'd actually say the Gartner statistic, for example, on the rate at which AI systems don't deliver business value, like 89 to 91%. That's probably pretty true everywhere. And if you think it's not true where you are, you might want to question that and re-examine it if you don't have controls in place. What is different is that in the third-party space now, a lot of the companies we see are either really small, they're too small to have resources on hand to actually manage their risks. They're not able to do the kinds of things we do where they build tools or sponsor research or provide guidance and make responsible practices easy. They're either too small to be able to afford to do that, or they're large enough that they have enough influence in the negotiation that they don't have to do what we're asking them to do. And they can push back on contractual terms. And so we ended up thinking, well, hang on, if our philosophy is to make this easy internally, to enable responsible practices by giving everyone everything they need to be able to test systems for fairness, make sure they're effective, transparent, safe, then why don't we give those same tools to our supply chain? Why don't we engage more with the community? Why don't we engage in more partnerships? Why don't we help our suppliers meet our standards, I suppose?
Excellent. Thanks, John. So, Amba, turning to you, there's been a really extensive infrastructure build-out with AI over the past number of months. We've seen massive capital expenditures, expansive deals that weave together the fates of many huge companies, from model developers to chip designers and the hardware manufacturers, et cetera. And that's led to a lot of talk about the potential societal impacts on the US and the global economies, and the potential for an AI bubble and the potential of a collapse. What if we're in an AI bubble? And so, Amba, I would love to have you talk a little bit about the AI infrastructure build out, the risks of an AI bubble, and the potential impacts on the public.
Very happy to, and thank you for having me. I will say I feel like I would have otherwise felt a little bit awkward moving from the conversation we were having to all the way there. But I think that one of the interesting, exciting things about this moment is that the big picture capital and narrative moves, we're sort of seeing quite concretely how they do relate and are playing out in what we're seeing in the market. So I think the joining the dots is hopefully going to be easier than it was some months ago. So where are we now? I think just like sort of to state facts, AI companies have in general chosen to go pretty much all in on a very capitally intensive version of building this technology. And I use the word chosen to deliberately, right? Now, for most of the tech giants, this has generally been good news, because way back in the mid-2010s, when the sort of writing was on the wall that this was a potentially lucrative technological trajectory, these firms by and large already controlled the capital, but also the key inputs to make a meal out of this technological trajectory. And if anything, and also pathways to monetization. And they also, very importantly, have the seemingly endless cash reserves to draw on to build at the frontier. So all seems, well and good for these players. But I think what has become clear in the last couple of months, definitely, and is a bit unsettling, is that for any company that isn't sitting on those cash reserves, or that scale of cash reserves, the OpenAIs or the Oracle, you can see that these firms are increasingly in the frenzied market moment. They're willing to court risk. They're willing to sell more aggressively and go to market, even when they may not be, in the opinion of everyone in this room, ready. And we're also seeing, certain triggers that activate the smell test, like something might be off here. We're seeing some of these companies turn to private credit markets to pay for this infrastructure build out. And so to say the quiet part loud, some of these instruments do touch on, insurance products that implicate our 401ks and our life insurance policies. We're also seeing, I'm sure many of your heads were spinning too, with the kind of circular financing deals, right? The NVIDIA OpenAI one being maybe the most prominent. And I think there, it's easy to see how the incentives could go sour very quickly, because it's OpenAI is leasing chips in NVIDIA data centers, and is leasing NVIDIA chips for data centers over 5 years. And every time they open a gigawatt of data center capacity, that's when NVIDIA invests back into them. So then the next week when we saw Sam Altman, his plan said, we're going to create a factory that can produce a gigawatt of new AI infrastructure every week. That's a pretty out there statement. What I hear is less that, oh, the demand is so palpable, and I hear much more like, oh, that's kind of how he's going to cut the, like how the check will be cut, right? And so I think that kind of, it's safe to say that the incentives are getting murky. And then the big question, or it sort of begs the question, which is, will this pay off? And that brings us to maybe the meat of what we're talking about today, which is, so Bain and Company, I feel like while everyone's been talking about whether, the big four consulting firms will still have relevance some years from now, they're coming up with all of the studies that we're quoting day in and day out. So, McKinsey tells us it's $5 trillion in AI investments to make good, will be required in order to meet demand. And the Bain and Company study that sort of rocked the news cycle was that would require in the next 5 years, by 2030, something like $2 trillion in annual revenue to have, for any of these expenditures to make sense. And so I think that there has been a kind of a collective pause in the markets, but also in the eyes of the public, especially because this has been timed with corporate America sending back its early report cards, and they're looking like decidedly lukewarm, right? Like it seems like there's some amount of struggle to realize on the big promises. And where I would say an organization like ours and a growing community of activists and advocates are at, we're looking at all of this pan out. And I think the number one question is that we can't be talking about this like it's another day on the market. The really important question is who will be left holding the bag? Even if this market correction sort of ends in crash, potentially unlikely if I had you to ask me my personal opinion, but maybe it ends in a kind of hyper consolidation. Either way, we're likely to see some kind of market correction. How will the public be implicated, and how do we protect the public from the implications of whatever we're about to see is, I think, top of mind. Whether that's the implications, I'm not going to spend too much more time listing them, but I mentioned our vulnerabilities as investors, but also more, at a larger scale as ratepayers. We're seeing, increased costs. We're seeing, recipients of government services are also going to be feeling the pinch of this frenzy. In that. My colleague Sarah and I have been referring to this as, we may not see the crash because we might actually be seeing the slow bailout. And the bailout is coming in the form of government contracts, which, again, sounds a little bit far off over there. But for the average public, this might mean that, contracts and integrations are made before they're ready and when they aren't fit for purpose. So there's a lot to unpack, but I think there are many ways in which the everyday person, the ratepayer, investors in the stock market might be already vulnerable to the ebbs and flows of this market. And at every level, I think the question to ask is, what's in it for us?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to stay in civil society and turn to you, Janet, to talk about a different aspect of this. As we can see, there are so many different perspectives coming at this. But if we're looking at what Data in Society does and looking at this research question, the crucial research that you're doing on the societal impacts of AI, and as we're looking at AI governance, let's talk about the contrast between the research that's happening within industry and then the research that's happening within civil society, academia. We have different sets of incentives, as Amba mentioned, and we also have different constraints. So I think there's important research happening in all of these sectors, but I would love your take specifically, the perspective from your vantage point in civil society on the types of research information that we don't currently have, but that we need, what can be improved with changes in methodology, and what information is missing for more effective and comprehensive AI governance research.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Great to see everyone. So I think this does all actually weave together, because I think what all of my colleagues up here are talking about is there is so much we do not know, and the way that we find that out is not through hype cycles or industry PR or anecdote, but through deep research that leads us to better understand how to govern these technologies, and how to govern not just the technology, but as Abba is talking about, the environment and the overall economic impacts of these technologies that we're seeing. So, I tend to think, I'm a little biased here, but I do tend to think that research is a critical underpinning of everything that we are talking about in this field, because things are moving so fast, and because so much of it, of what we understand, is driven by PR and by hype. So I guess a couple of things I'll throw out. What I would posit is true is that we need an evidence base to build good governance. That is critical. I would also say that one of the things that I think we've arrived at as a field over, honestly, the past 10 years is that technology has societal impacts. And that was not actually a given 10 years ago, or in some cases even 5 or 6 years ago. And the reason that we can say that with confidence is because of the research that has shown that over and over again. So that is a starting point for how I would think about research and governance, and the connections between those two, that without the research that showed us the bias and discrimination in predictive AI systems, we wouldn't have governance objects like the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. So those are very, very important connections. I would say in terms of what I think we need now in the research space, I think there are a lot of things we need, but I'll throw out 3 ideas. One really big thing that we don't have, and we haven't really had for many years, is access to data. So it's very, very hard to do research on the impacts of technologies on society, on the economy, on the environment, without access to data from the tools that we are talking about. And I think one of the things that is really tough about this is that has been the case for a long time. That was also the case with social media companies, although I will say that in comparison to the AI labs, social media companies were quite a bit more open with sharing their data. So we are in a worse position than we were when we were just trying to figure out what in the world was going on Facebook. And so I also just want to give a shout out to a great organization, the Coalition for Independent Tech Research, which I'm sure there are members of that coalition in this room, and they are fighting the good fight for access to data that can tell us much more about what is happening. But I will say that data is not enough. Right? When we learn about the world through data that is collected on platforms or through ChatGPT or Claude, if we ever got that data, we understand only what our behaviors are on those platforms within that closed logic loop of the platform itself. And that doesn't really tell us anything about the actual social impacts of these technologies, right? It doesn't tell us about the primary effects even, but it certainly doesn't tell us about the secondary or tertiary effects. And so it's just not enough. And so what we really need to be investing in, I think, dramatically more than we are now, is grounded research with and by the communities that are most impacted by these tools. There is very, very little of this research being done, even in academia. And I can say in the AI labs, some of which do have social impact research teams, they are not doing that level of qualitative research. They are not going out into schools, for instance, to see what is going on with kids using ChatGPT. How are the teachers changing their classrooms? How are the kids learning? How are parents trying to cope with this? These are the kinds of things that we need to know, but we just don't know because, again, when we do get any information through the AI labs, it is really through that narrow lens of what are the prompts going into and out of the tools that we're talking about. So that's a huge gap. It's something we work on a lot at Data and Society. An example of a project that we're working on right now in that vein is a cross-sector labor research project. We're looking to understand what are the impacts of generative AI in a bunch of different sectors, in nursing, in trucking, in retail, in fashion, because we want to be able to see across those different communities of workers, different professions, to really understand what are the ways that power changes, how does workflow change, how do people understand their work differently, how do they gain or lose agency, how is surveillance increasing in the workplace when these tools come into being. And then the third thing I'll just throw out there as something I think we need in research is we need feedback loops as AI laws are starting to come online. Like, we really need to understand as we pass laws, as the EU AI Act comes online, as SB 53 in California and the Colorado AI Act and many others are actually starting to be implemented, we need to learn what's happening on the other side of those words on paper. What are the trade-offs that policymakers and civil servants are making as those come into being? How are companies reacting to them? And what are the real societal impacts of those laws? Are they actually making the technology more accountable? Or are they, providing compliance checklists that don't actually leave the legal teams of the companies that we're worried about? So, that need to sort of build I think really a global network of policy researchers that are looking at the impacts of these laws and creating a feedback loop where we can be iterating and learning and understanding what the real trade-offs are when we try to govern these technologies is a critical next step in the governance space.
Thank you so much, Janet. Thanks for giving us some concrete recommendations. Really appreciate that. And I want to kind of stay with the solutions, mitigations, improvements kind of space here. And Belva, I want to turn to you for this next question. Can you tell us a little more about mitigations for frontier models and the kinds of processes that you employ and consider in the responsible development of Google DeepMind models?
For sure. I actually want to call out one bit from what Janet just mentioned with respect to compliance and not having a compliance checklist. Like, that is so important to me doing this work in industry. And there's a lot of work, I promise, it's happening behind the scenes in some places. And this kind of ties into the question as well with processes, right? Because how do you prevent an internal team from just being a last check before a model goes out? And there's a lot of deep work that we do at DeepMind on my team on frontier risks with respect to, everything that's in the frontier safety framework, which is a bunch of things, think chem, bio, nuclear, all of that stuff. But beyond that, just emerging risks as well, beyond that framing. Some examples are emotional or affective use cases for models, persuasion. How does this manifest across different models? And I like to think about it in two ways. We have the verticals, which are different capability areas. So you could classify them across the board. Some key ones of focus right now are agents, worlds or simulators. You could argue robotics is another key vertical, kind of at the frontier areas of focus of what we're focused on. Not that there's many others focused on LLMs. My team is really focused on the emerging stuff. And then you can think about what are the cross-cutting horizontal areas that intersect with those capabilities, right? You can't boil the ocean. There's no way I could figure out absolutely every single risk that could ever happen in the wild with the world model. But what are some key areas that we see are as emerging, and what do we want to invest in One example is like the affective stuff is really, really important right now. For a variety of reasons, and there's a lot of work to do, especially on frontier models for affective use cases. So we try to see where those two things intersect, and then we write like 10 to 12 page assessments, not released, unfortunately, but that bring together like multidimensional teams across the company, and we build a lot of safety buy-in, right? Because there's all sorts of things that model teams, they're at a different pace. They want to deploy, which that's their job, right? And not being a function that puts on the brakes, but rather is a ongoing safety responsibility advisory, I think it does really work, and we've had a lot of success from that. And you can't release a robotics model without physical safety in mind. Like it's very, very core. So how do you make safety or societal impacts synonymous with quality? That is if folks are interested in pitching internally to maybe non-safety people, I think that's a really good place to start. And that gets into all the mitigations and process work that we do. But I think people forget that mitigations are not, a single safety classifier applied at the production level, preventing a certain type of content from generating, or, supervised fine-tuning data that you might be using to steer model behavior. All of that is super important, but there's also like micro levers, right? Like what are the types of research happening? How do we operationalize the research? That's a really big challenge too. And I work with like social impact researchers all the time. I'm one as well. Like, how do we go beyond that was a really nice paper? And how do we put that into practice? And that is an art and maybe not a science quite yet, but there's a lot of that process work that happens behind the scenes that I like to think of as like developmental governance, or like lowercase g governance. And maybe we shouldn't even call it governance, honestly, if it accomplishes the same thing that we want it to accomplish, then there will always be a compliance version everywhere, right? Because you need to comply to the laws, to the regulations. But how do you go beyond that, and how do you build space for that? How do you build repeatable processes that scale, that are not, obstructing the critical path to deployment, but actually helping like nurture it? And how do you create longer term timelines for risks that are perhaps not fully fleshed out today, but 6 to 12 months ahead that you can start planning for now? And that's kind of, that's what I like to think is like the sweet spot for maybe lowercase g governance work. But you need both. And I think that balance is a major challenge.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Bilva. All right, John, we're going to kind of stay in this emerging space. I want to talk a little bit about governance of agentic AI. We know that the problems and the potential mitigations get more complicated as you move into agentic AI. So would love to know how your approach to governance might change with agentic AI systems. What issues are you seeing from your vantage point in this next era?
Yeah, sure thing. I will say, first off, I blame jet lag, but it is a pleasure and an honor to be here. Got to it eventually. All right. One way to think about what we do in governance, which I think is where I'm going to start here, is we try to stay ahead of the adoption of technology in the enterprise, certainly in context where you're in a governance function in a company like mine. You try to stay ahead, and you try to understand what the risk factors are in the technology that you're putting out there, what the controls need to be for those risk factors, how you develop tools to enable people to implement those controls more effectively, where you need to sponsor research to close gaps, etc., right? And you want to stay ahead not just of the initial adoption where a bunch of business owners jump in with both feet and they start running with scissors, but you want to stay ahead of the potential other shoe. So, for example, we all started using generative AI, and then we started seeing papers about how reliance on generative AI affected your critical thinking, your ability to perform the functions that you now leverage generative AI to do. And so the sweet spot is if you are able to get risk controls in before at least widespread use of technology, right? I will say that while the enterprise really jumped into generative AI, a lot of those same folks kind of got burned by realizing actually AI is kind of hard and are going slower with agentic. That's the good side. What we're looking at right now is, okay, between now and that point, maybe it's 6 or 9 months from now, when the enterprise starts to feel emboldened and really start to leverage agents in serious ways beyond a few use cases where they're testing it out, like in that period, how are we going to think about autonomy versus risk, right? There are frameworks that are coming out for this. I'm not saying anything necessarily new here, but which of those makes sense? And when we start thinking about particular questions like, okay, it's a multi-agent framework, is the risk additive? Is it multiplicative? Like, how do you think about increasing complexity of these systems relative to their autonomy and the autonomy of their components and the risks associated with that increased autonomy, right? And like anything we do in a governance function, you have to be testing your ideas with the systems that start to come out. You have to be sponsoring research. You have to be doing all those things I described. Otherwise, you end up in a situation where the appetite to use those systems is so great that people are willing to take the perceived risk of them perhaps not working terribly well. And when you reach that point, that's when adoption flips and you're sort of behind the curve. I'll echo Janet here and say we don't have all the answers. We need to find them. That is urgent work, it's important, and that continues to be true just like it has for years in this space.
Yeah. Thanks, John. All right, so we're going to do one last question, a little bit of a lightning round here. Amba wanted to talk to you about the potential bubble that you had been talking about. Could we just double click on the incentives piece of that? Can we talk a little about like where you see market incentives aligning with and diverging from the public interest? Just really fast.
Okay, well, I guess to go back to what I was saying earlier, right? Like there was a moment where the bubble murmurs were getting louder, and it was in that week that we had, an infamous AI company CEO tweet that the sort of sycophancy problem was somewhat maybe solved. Either way, they were going to be turning up the dial and also, putting in place age gating mechanisms, and we were going to have chatbots for erotica. And so that sort of AGI to sex bots slide, it was very quick. It was quicker than many expected, and it was hard not to see the connections between the two. And I think that in an interesting way, the conversation we've just had has also brought to light that there are going to be places like robotics where the argument for or the incentives for privacy and security are baked in. And I cut my teeth at Mozilla and have also worked closely with Signal through my career, and I have worked at organizations where the privacy and security promise is not just the mission, it's also the product differentiator. But we have to be real that is not the case for the vast majority of this market. I think it's the place where I'm most hopeful incentives align very quickly is in the enterprise space, because I think you need high degrees of sort of reliability and trust for any of these things to make sense, and I'm sure my colleagues on the right will also agree. And so I think there, it's the bigger question is, unlike cybersecurity, how do we make sure that privacy and security is thought of as a market asset and not just a cost center? Like, how does that reframe happen? In the consumer market, this is what keeps me up at night. I think any parent in the room, it's addictive designs, it's personalized advertising all the way down. We have a decade of evidence to tell us exactly how this will go. I think that should keep us up at night, our political representatives up at night. Like, we would love to trust the companies, but I think the more the more sort of reasonable, prudent, and just common sense approach is zero trust, but create an environment where we don't have to trust them.
Fantastic. I wish we had time to continue this conversation because I know we have a lot more to say, but I want to thank you so much, each of our panelists, for providing their contributions and perspective from your vantage point across the AI governance ecosystem. So please join me in thanking our panelists.